Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Tasneem Abrams, and this is the Private Practice Growth Club YouTube channel where I share tips, tools, and tutorials for health professionals starting and growing private practices in South Africa. As you know, I like to feature practice owners, past and present, who have built practices and that we can learn from. And today I have Chantelle Stander, who is an occupational therapist in private practice and has an amazing team of occupational therapists. And so I'd like to welcome Chantelle, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's such a privilege. As you know, I'm really excited about today. So thank you for having me on your channel.
Chantelle, can we start off with you telling us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and where are you from?
Okay, so I grew up on the East Rand in Gauteng. I didn't actually really know what I was planning on studying. So I went to a psychometrist and they did all those tests, and I ended up shadowing a speech therapist, an OT, a PT, and a dietitian. Those were sort of the directions they sent me, and they did indicate medicine, but I'm definitely not the bloods and gore type, so I knew that wouldn't work out for me. And I ended just falling in love with what the occupational therapist did. And I was actually at a school for special needs where one of my best friend's moms was a special teacher at that time. And I went into OT thinking I'm going to be a PEDS OT. And then at Stellenbosch University, where I studied, I was exposed to psychiatry. And I had the absolute fortune of being allocated to a private psychiatric unit for my psych block in third year. And just absolutely loved the work, found that I had a natural inclination for mental health. Yeah, and then went into ComServe, did ComServe in the clinics, the rural clinics, and knew I was going to do mental health. And I think here by September, October, all my friends had found jobs already and everyone was certain what they were doing. And I was like, well, there's no mental health job available, so I don't know what I'm doing next year. And then a position opened at a private practice in Centurion, and I applied, not thinking I would get the job, got the job, and I've been at the same practice ever since. So just in a nutshell, I started working at the practice in 2011 and then got promoted to manager in 2013, and in 2015, end of 2015, the then owner and I had a conversation. She was intending to retire and I was offered the opportunity to buy over the practice. So since March 2016, I've been the owner of the practice, and I think, yeah, that's pretty much been my journey so far.
That's amazing. You know, I often hear I always find it amusing when I speak to occupational therapists in particular about how they chose OT. And majority of people either were going into the medical field or they wanted to be a doctor and they didn't know about OT, or they went into OT thinking they would become a pediatric OT. I mean, I'm no different. And then through obviously the exposure to different fields, they actually discover what they really enjoy. So I just find that really amusing that your story is so similar. And I think it's probably because most people, if they have heard of occupational therapy, it's usually because we work in so many different areas. It's usually whatever your exposure was. So if you've had a loved one who had a stroke or hand injury, then you know about the splints or about the rehabilitation. And if you've had a child, or know of a child that had to go to, or you were a child that had to go to OT, that's your frame of reference. But I think not a lot of people have exposure to OT in the mental health space because most OTs in mental health are in hospital settings. And so people don't often talk about their experience in hospital, like you don't necessarily talk about the OT and stuff like that. So tell me quickly, what was it about mental health specifically that really attracted you to that, and especially from already student time?
So I think my first thought was when I went to this private facility, I was so shocked to realize that this person could have been me, or I could have been in their shoes. I think for me, it was just the absolute relatability to the clients. And then I must say, I was then properly exposed to activities and goals. I think, a lot of my exposure previously had been to PEDS, and then going in and seeing the immense power of an activity to, just help the patient open up, to help improve self-awareness, to teach skills in a fun way. And to this day, that's something I'm so incredibly passionate about, is how activities like our medium of therapy can have such far-reaching, what's the word that I'm looking for, abilities to really connect with the patient and for them to learn skills without even realizing it. So yeah, I'm very, very passionate about utilizing activities in mental health as a means to connect with the client and to create universality and to get them connecting with one another. So that's always been, I think, where I found my flow, is in those kind of sessions. And that's what really drew me to mental health.
So your first exposure to mental health was obviously as a student in private practice already. And, so that's quite unique, because a lot of people only get exposed to private practice mental health after they've graduated. But through your university exposure, you would have also been exposed to public health. So can you maybe give a overview of what, in your perspective, are the key differences and challenges when you compare mental health occupational therapy in a private sector versus in a public sector?
I think my first thought would be restrictions in public sectors, just the limitations in terms of resources. We do make use of a lot of activities in mental health, and you don't have the same tools and materials available in government facilities as you would in private. I think one of the benefits of private of public sector over private is actually just the time you have with clients. I think in private, we know we have maximum 21 days with a patient in hospital, and unfortunately after their discharge, there's often no or limited funds for all mental health services following discharge. To be honest, if I was the client and I have to prioritize co-payment on my medication over maybe OT, I think I would probably make the same decision to maybe rather do the co-payment as opposed to additional OT services. But I think that's one thing that lacks, is that we don't have a lot of time, and then aftercare is really very limited, because often our patients have their financial struggles as well. So that, what I love in the public sector is just, besides the duration you have them, is also the available time in the day. In private sector, we are quite strapped for resources, so we have to work quickly. You have to move through the steps of your patients quite quickly, and it's always hard finding that balance between what do they need and what is actually feasible to give them in the limited time, because I'd rather them have one skill that they can actually use than having knowledge of 5 skills and not being able to use any one of the 5. So in terms of time restrictions, it's also quite hard in private trying to make the most of the limited resources.
You almost want to have a combination of the positives from each, where you have that more flexibility of time to work with clients as you do in public. But the benefit of having that constraint in private is that you are more efficient and not wasteful of resources, which often happens in government. I found that when I worked in government in psychiatric units, you do have your arts and crafts materials and things like that, but you are less mindful about how much you use, there is that risk of being wasteful. So if we could have almost that mindfulness that you get in private, because you know that every second and every paintbrush and pencil that you use is money, but also have the capability to think, okay, what is for the best? What can I think beyond just the essentials and actually give this person more than that? If we could have a marriage of the two, that would be amazing. But unfortunately, that's not the reality we have. We'll see what NHI brings. That will probably bring a whole other kettle of challenges. But I'd like to ask you then, in terms of then working in private, you mentioned that aftercare is a big issue. And I mean, I would say in government, it's not that much different, because there's long queues, long waiting lists, etc. But you're not the first person that I actually had a coaching session with, also private psychiatric OT, hospital-based OTs. And this was one of their like passions. They really want to offer more aftercare services because, as you know, that actually when you go back into the community, that's when, you know, a lot of the OTs really needed even more. But unfortunately, you are limited because of funding. And a lot of that is actually not because the person is financially constrained, but because of the way that OT is perceived in terms of who makes decisions around funding. So can you talk to me a little bit about, obviously you're involved with billing, and in hospital is very different to an outpatient psychiatric clinic. So OT is covered for in hospital, but as soon as the person is discharged, we are not categorized as mental health practitioners. Can you just talk to me about what your views are on that and what your experiences and frustrations have been around that?
For the longest time, my thoughts around it has been, it doesn't help we're sending the patient home with medication, but they're not being taught the skill. They don't have follow-up when they've tried to use the skills and maybe not been as successful as they've hoped, to come back and have those resources to role play, to practice, to get feedback, to have the support of a group in hospital. So I often say to the clients, it's not just about the medication. It's really important, but we also need to make lifestyle changes. We need to be addressing the origin of the psychosocial triggers. So my thought is that OT is so crucial in helping maintain their health, preventing relapse. But as you say, unfortunately, we're not seen as part of the minimum services post-discharge. And I think what I find in practice is we often have patients who are keen because they see the benefit of OT. But then we often struggle. Either they make appointments and they don't arrive, so you've set out time in your day and no one pitches, or they make the appointment, they arrive, but then it's a massive story to get them to pay for the service. And unfortunately, I always say additional services in our practice, like outpatient care, we've still got to pay rent. We've got to have therapists available to pay salaries, or to pay salaries too. So even when a patient doesn't pitch, there's still a cost involved in that session that doesn't take place. So it's not just about the loss of income, but it's also about the expenses to have gotten that session booked in the first place. So those are some of our challenges in our practice, where we don't necessarily have the buy-in from the rest of the MDT to really motivate the client to come for OT. So for us, it's often if the client is really motivated, they'll come and they'll make a plan. But if the rest of the team isn't on board, for the majority of our clients, they don't understand the value of what we could offer post-discharge.
So what do you think? I mean, there's a lot of OTs in this position, right? And then there's the ones who are not hospital-based like you, who are trying to offer outpatient occupational therapy. What would you say would be our role as occupational therapists? Like I'm very passionate about this idea that we need to take our victim hat off and kind of look at how can we be part of the solution instead of just complaining about the problem all the time. So what do you think our role is as occupational therapists in advocating for our position as to be known as mental health practitioners, particularly among the funders and the mentors?
So Tasneem, my thoughts around that would be, as an individual practitioner, I would definitely encourage therapists to go out and go and visit, make appointments with the psychiatrist, with the psychologist, go and explain to them. I think what I found one of the most beneficial marketing tools has been when we do get a referral for a client, or if we recommend, we really think this client will benefit from further outpatient therapy, making sure that you give concise and good quality feedback to the person that you received the referral from. So that often helps in terms of marketing, but that's also a really time-consuming activity. I think what I see other therapists doing, and what seems to be working quite well, is a lot of marketing around what are the services you offer. Something that I'm not particularly so good at, but what seems to be working well is, social media pages, sharing information that gives value to the client before they've even joined or signed up for your services, and showing them this is the value that OT could add. And then obviously they get so much more value when they actually sign up, and making sure that that information is being broadcast to whether it's multidisciplinary team or potential future clients. But I agree with you. I think as OTs, we really need to stand up and profess to the world what we have to offer. A lot of it, I think, is also around outcomes, being able to prove. So for example, at the moment in the practice, one of our team members is doing research as part of her master's for what the impact on self-efficacy is that a specific series of therapy that we offer has on clients. Our aim is to communicate that with a multidisciplinary team. We're trying to give specific feedback to referral sources of this is what your specific client benefited, or, this is the improvement we see in them, to really showcase what OT is delivering. But I think it's so hard as a new therapist when you need to navigate maybe starting your own practice and managing payroll and tax and business registration and all these things to still actually have time to go out and think of all these marketing efforts. And so I think organizations like yourself and INTASA and INSTOPP and all these other OT organizations do quite a lot, but I'm always mindful that most of those people are also volunteers and doing it in their free time. So my last thought on that would be, OTs join forces, get involved, offer a little bit of your time. If all of us offer a little bit of time, we can do so much because we're such an undervalued profession, and it's simply because we don't raise our voices. Last note on that, I think in mental health, assertiveness is a lot of what we do with our clients, and that's probably been the most useful skill for me as an individual. And I just realized as OT, we're often the soft, caring, kind, compassionate individuals. We just need to practice those skills of being assertive and standing up when the time is ripe to advocate for what we do as a profession.
Absolutely. We mustn't be the carpenters without cupboards. Yeah. But I'm glad you brought up now some of the realities of the business side of having a private practice, and your story or journey is unique to some of the other practice owners I've had on, in that you didn't start your own practice from scratch. You bought a practice that you had already been working in for a while, which I think is really valuable insights to share, because I do get a lot of questions from people, not to myself necessarily, but in the Facebook group, asking about buying and selling a practice. And at the end of the day, you're purchasing a business, right? So it is a business decision that you have to make. Let's first talk about, before we talk about the buying of this practice, you mentioned that you were working there and became a manager. So it's almost like it was a little bit of a steps up, like you were taking a transition towards where you are now. So let's first talk about the transition to manager, and what are some of the key lessons you learned about managing a practice? Because obviously you then developed the skills you needed to then own a practice, because as a practice owner, you're also managing people, right? So what were some of those key lessons that you learned in that beginning period when you were transitioning to manager?
I think probably the most important and the hardest lesson was initially when I applied for the position and then received the position. I was like, okay, I'm taking on a bit more responsibility. I'm going to do more things. And in my mind, a lot of that was, I want to say, logistics, like managing this, attending this meeting, making these decisions. And I think the hardest lesson and the most valuable lesson, something I carry with me to this day, is you've actually got to build relationships with the team. And it's about navigating the different interpersonal styles within the team as successfully as possible, keeping in mind that we're all different individuals. I think what was really hard stepping into the manager position is up until that point, we'd all been on the same level. We were all peers. I was the most senior person in the team, but only by a year. And I think navigating that shift from previously I was your friend and now I'm actually the one needing to hold you accountable or to delegate duties, and to do that in a way that preserves our relationship, but also recognizing that the relationship dynamic cannot stay the same. And I think in a long period of the early years, then again, transitioning into practice owner, that was really hard for me, because I was like, now suddenly I'm not your friend anymore. And that was really hard for me on a personal level to accept that I'm now your boss and you do look at me differently. And as much as I would like to stay your buddy, it's not a realistic or reasonable expectation of me to put on myself or on the people in my team, because at the end of the day, the dynamic inevitably is different. And I think getting that in the early years, because a few of them had been with me from the time that it had been owned by someone else and from the time that I'd not yet been practice manager, yeah, it was really a difficult and a very, I want to say, emotional process for me. So that introspection and, I was listening to podcasts and audiobooks and trying my best to navigate. And I think in those early days, I was so hard on myself. Like every small thing that didn't go the way I anticipated it would go felt like such a blow to me. And I think over the years, learning just to navigate the relationship part and being able to respect the difference in dynamic that team members would have with one another versus what they would have with me was really challenging for me. So I think I'm quite a detail-oriented person. I'm very a logical thinker. I do very well with processes and protocols and putting those in place. So I think the business side of it for me was almost more of I can go somewhere, I can Google or I can inquire what the steps are, and I can follow the steps. I think that the interpersonal dynamic felt to me a lot more or a lot less structured and a lot more I had to figure it out on the fly.
Because it's not like tangible stuff. Like it's not like if A happens, then you do B, like you said, like the business stuff is stuff you can, like this, an overload of information and there's steps you can follow. Those things which they call soft skills, which are definitely not soft because they're very difficult. But I would say then thinking about that, what support do you wish you had known to access or was available for you at that time? What type of support? What would be the nature of support that you would say to other people who are on that similar journey that they should seek out early on in order to give them that, support they need from a mindset point of view?
I think two things stand out for me. The first one would be getting a coach, paying another practice owner that has a reputable practice and letting them guide you through the steps. Like, people have these things in place. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but I'm also mindful that if you ask someone for mentorship, they are taking time out of their day, out of their practice. So that would be my first thought, is make that financial investment in yourself and get someone who's been where you're at and who has gone through the motions to help you with the day-to-day. And then my other thought would be, something that I really advocate for now is, especially being in mental health, is I worry about therapists who don't do therapy. Like, you've got a lot on your plate. And I think for me as a mental health therapist, you hear a lot of stuff from your clients. And though I think I'm pretty good at putting that boundary in terms of their emotional baggage remains with them, and I'm only there to support on the journey, managing the practice, having your own life, having your own things happening in the background of work. For me, in addition to someone who can coach you through the business and practice aspects, is having someone where you can offload and where you can do your emotional processing, or, maybe if that's not your vibe, do a journal, do some kind of growth mindset activities. But I think the key for me is that consistency, having something where someone or something is waiting for you. Because I think in the early days, I had the insight that I needed many of these things, but it was very haphazard. So if and when I have time, I'll listen to a podcast and I'll write a few ideas down, or I'll check in with that person. But I think as I got older, being like, I booked this appointment, come hell or high water, that appointment will be upheld. Yes, there's maybe something happening in the practice, but if I don't take care of me first, the practice and everyone in it will suffer. And I would say in the last year or two, had the insight of that coaching time is booked into the schedule. It's not negotiable. The me time, the wellness time is booked. It's not negotiable. As we say in mental health, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
But I think as OTs, we're very innovative, finding ways to pull all the threads together without recognizing how we sacrifice ourselves. So that would be my thought on get business and practice mentorship and get some kind of emotional, psychological support in the process, because it's a heavyweight to carry.
Yeah. And obviously as a practice owner, you are singular, so it's quite lonely and you have a lot of decisions you have to make that's weighing on you in the background. But then let's talk about then that transition to practice owner. So you mentioned that the practice owner was retiring and you had a conversation. And what was your first thought? Like, did you see it coming? And when she did, approach this idea of you buying the practice, what was your initial thought? Were you like, yes, I'll go for it? Or was it like, what was your initial reaction?
I must be honest, for as long as I can remember working at the practice, I was always like, one day I hope I have the opportunity to become a partner.
Okay.
That was my affirmation. Was affirming it in my own life. But it did come as quite a shock. I didn't realize it would happen as soon as it did. But the moment it did, I was like, yes, please. This is what I've been affirming to happen in my life. And I think for me, having knowledge of how the practice works, having, as you mentioned, slowly climbing the ladder and getting more involved in different aspects of the business. It didn't feel like you're taking on this brand new venture without any knowledge of what's happening. I built really good relationships with the referring members of the team, with the nursing staff, with the hospital management. So it felt like a very natural progression for me. But yeah, I think I was very fortunate in that setup that everything had sort of shifted from me being a junior therapist to developing some responsibility and then being able to take over full responsibility. And I also had the great fortune of them offering the practice owner and her husband, who was quite involved in running the business aspect of the practice, offering for a year-long almost mentorship when I brought over. So I initially paid particularly her husband a salary, and he helped me transition all the things, helped me understand certain of the background, VAT and tax and all those kind of things. I think so a very useful tip is, if you can, if you're buying over a practice, try and not go cold turkey, but have an arrangement with a current practice owner, or at the very least someone who's very knowledgeable about the practice running day-to-day work, that can help see you through that transition into the full practice. So that was I think a very valuable deal that was part of our buy and sell contract.
So like you said, because you had been working in the practice for so long, I think probably one of the advantages you had over somebody who's buying a practice that they have they've never worked in the practice, they don't know the practice owner, they just decided to buy a practice, is that you had an opportunity to look behind the curtain, so to speak, and see what they, how they run things and get to know the practice owner. And it sounds like one of the things that really made the practice already successful to the point where you were going to buy it was the fact that the practice owner had someone who was assisting with the business side of the practice, being her husband. So how much of a role do you think that plays in being a clinician who is also the business owner, of having someone who can look at the business without the clinical lenses, because that can sometimes cloud our decision making, and sort of support the business structure, the structural side of the business part of the practice?
I think it's very useful if you have someone like that. And I think in the early days, I didn't necessarily have someone like that. And I'm someone who appreciates a hands-on approach. I want to know what's happening in every level. But that being said, some of the key decisions I think that I made at that point was keeping certain contracts in place. So the practice already had a contract with a company that was doing salaries and payroll and VAT and tax and all of those things. They already had a company who was responsible for dealing with the billing and the accounts, that I'm trying to think, and a labor, a retainer with a labor company to help deal with that. So in the early days, I made the decision to just take over those contracts and maintain them and keep them in place. And then once things had settled with the practice, then I started doing my research and finding, people that I felt more comfortable with, or maybe had better service offerings for what we needed, or were a bit more specialized in healthcare. Because I think a lot of accountants or all these firms that help with your stuff don't always know healthcare practice. Our practices look different, or our businesses look different from other, maybe different business models. So I had those things in place. And I think till this day, I have that in place, because I just realized that if I have to try and keep my finger on everything, there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to focus on what is the core of my job. And that is maintaining the clinical part, that is the income generating part of the business. So that would be really important for me. I think a lot of times when therapists contact me when they want to start practices, they're very hesitant about having a company do their billing, because there's an expense involved. And I think, just very at first glance, it looks very expensive. But for me, knowing that that's not something I have to worry about, that it gets taken care of, that if there's account queries, I have a neutral person I can send my to, is such a peace of mind. But also you need the right people. You need to know you have a company handling it. So I think my thoughts would also be just in terms of recognizing your strengths and weaknesses. I'm not good with finances. I never had accounting at school. Yes, I did it because I had to, and it was a lot of effort and work. So I think also as a practice owner, knowing what are the things you are good at and investing in that and finding people that are good or better than you at other things, because you cannot possibly keep your finger on everything. And I think as a mental health therapist, one of my biggest priorities has always been what I preach. I don't want to tell my clients boundaries and balanced lifestyle when in fact I'm not sleeping because I have to wake up at 4 a.m. to do this so that I can do therapy, so that at night I can pick up on that. That's the truth. That's the early days of the practice. I woke up at 4, I worked till 6, I went to work, did my clinical work, came home, worked for an hour and a half. But I think I also knew that that was a short-term commitment whilst I was paying for practice. And I made the decision then that the moment the practice is paid off, that money would be invested into either a practice manager or someone who would alleviate some of the load off my plate so that I could focus on my clinical work.
Yeah. So we'll get into the aspect of actually making the decision to buy the practice. But I think you said something really important. It's beyond also knowing your strengths and weaknesses. You said something really critical, which was also that you have time to focus on the core, which is the income generating activities. And I think that's the thing that people kind of forget, that you have a limited capacity and your time should be focused more on bringing in the income. And the minute you are doing these other things, which are all important, like because billing and that brings in money as well, but there are administrative tasks that don't require you. You are the thing, only you can do the clinical. So obviously in a team situation, you have a team, but most people start a practice and it's just them. Only you can do the therapy, right? So if you're not doing the therapy, then you have nothing to bill. So if you're taking time out from the income generating activity to do the administrative that don't bring any money in, then are you really efficient with your time? So yes, you're going to spend money to get somebody else to do it, but it means you then have time to bring in more money to be able to afford that person. And that's, I think, also a mindset shift that people often need to take. And obviously in the beginning, you don't have the capital to just, employ this one and that one. So given that, if you had to start from scratch, like you didn't buy a practice, knowing what you know now, if you had to start from scratch where it's just you initially and you're starting a practice and knowing you have this vision that eventually you want to let go of certain tasks and activities, and you have a limited amount of capital to invest in your business, what would you say of all those services you use? Which one would you say would be the one you would prioritize first? So like what would be the order that you would say, okay, now I've got some money, I'll first do that one, then when I have more money, I'll then pay this one, etc.
I think my personal opinion, but I realize this is just an opinion, would be billing. I think there's so much value for me in not being the person providing the therapy and be the person chasing you for an outstanding account. For me, the fact that I can have a singular dynamic relationship with my patient is so valuable. And I think the billing part is also something that takes up so much time because it's phoning for authorization. It's, in our case, in hospital therapy, it's phoning to hear why benefits were taken from savings as opposed to the enhanced hospital benefits. It's writing treatment motivations and these kind of things. I think my key idea would probably be billing, but I think from a skill set for me, the first thing that I would have to outsource, but that would only happen when you really have staff, is your salaries, because I think that's also, I do not want trouble with such. I want to know everything is sorted, everything is in order, but I definitely think, as I say, billing. I don't want to have that deep relationship where, I think especially with us, I'm seeing the payer, whereas I think in a peds practice, the parent is the payer, but you're seeing the child. But for me, going back into therapy after I had phoned you because your account is outstanding, it creates a dynamic that interferes with the value of the therapy that I can give and with our relationship, that I would say that would be my first to outsource.
Yeah. And I think, linked to that, if you do your own billing, because you maybe invest in a practice management software, but you then decide to get like a bookkeeper or an accountant. And what I did in the early days was to say to my accountant, I'm going to create an email address for you called accounts@, and I'll give you access to that email, and then you can be the one to deal with like unpaid and things like that, because that's part of that can be, part of the retainer fee, so that you get somebody that can do your books and deal with the accounts, but you still do, the billing on your side, especially if you want to get to know the codes and all of that stuff in the beginning. Yeah. Nobody has to know that you're the one who's actually making the invoice. It still comes from your account's email address. But absolutely, I do agree with you that having that separation, especially in a hospital-based setting, it's obviously different in different settings, but I think especially because they come in and it's quite an acute, a lot of the cases. So it's quite a traumatic experience for somebody also to be admitted, and so to have to also deal with those. Some great advice there. So I want to move on to the point of now you were approached by the practice and you were excited because this was something that you had manifested. You wanted to be able to be a part of this practice. But then, of course, you have to sit down with the numbers and make a logical decision. So take me through that, like, mental gymnastics you had to go through to make the decision. Who did you consult with? What did you take into consideration? And like, what advice would you give to others who are looking to buy practice in terms of how they make the decision of whether a practice is worth buying or not?
So I think my first thought is when I got approached, they'd already had the practice valuated. So they brought an accountant or chartered accountants, I'm not sure, the whole document saying, this is the income, these are the expenses, etc., etc. I then asked for all the information, and we had an independent firm do an evaluation. And obviously, there's always discrepancy between these kinds of things. So we had quite a few meetings where we sat down and we discussed, we negotiated a little bit around, what would be a reasonable price to pay for the practice. I think in our setting, because our referrals come from in-hospital, there is a stream of referrals. So my thought would be, if you're buying an outpatient practice, especially if the practice owner is maybe moving their practice elsewhere or patients are coming specifically for the person, my thought would be you'd have to be very smart around how you go about evaluating and buying. But in our case, the referral source was quite stable. And as you said, I'd been there for quite a while. I'd been the key point of contact for quite a few years. So the referring clinicians knew me well, and a lot of it came through me. So I had a lot of, I want to say, security that referral source wouldn't dry. Many of my clients wouldn't leave to follow the therapist or whatever the case may be. But I think one of the biggest tips that I would like to offer therapists buying over an existing practice is, besides the financials, because that's one aspect of it, make sure that the billing codes that are being used are actually accurate. I think in our case, after buying over the practice later, I became aware that not all of the billing was accurate. The numbers were a bit inflated compared to what they should have been. And that, unfortunately, I only realized retrospectively, and that had to be fixed. And there's a whole rigmarole of things that happened with that. But my thought would be really have a look at what are the services being offered, what are the codes that are being charged for that service, and make sure that aligns with what's being advocated to use by ATASA and organizations like INSTOPP, so that what is being billed accurately reflects what should be done. Because I've unfortunately just heard of a few new practice owners who bought over existing practices who, through things like audits, found out that the billing hadn't been accurate. And it's a bit of a bummer when you pay a certain price because that's what the practice appears to be worth, but it's actually not exactly worth that.
And I suppose that is to your point that when you do bring on externals, that they must be familiar with medical practices. I've had so many practices or people who consult with me that they say, no, my accountant said I should incorporate as a PTY Limited, and then they obviously not allowed to because the accountant doesn't know that's some of the rules and regulations. And then with the billing, that's also like, it's so difficult. Just at our event on Sunday, somebody asked, she's an optometrist and they obviously sell products as well, the lenses and stuff. And she was saying like, how do you ensure cash flow? Because the topic that was presented was around cash flow. And, the accountant was giving some tips around like, around selling products and things like that. And then there's also that consideration that we are so regulated in terms of what we are and are not allowed to bill for, to sell, how much we can bill for certain things, how often. So it's important that whoever you bring in to do the valuation is familiar and has worked with medical practices before. But then also, just like you said, that, when it comes to billing your patients, it's best to have someone else deal with that. I think also then in the whole buying and selling, it is best for both parties to have their own independence and let them be the ones to talk to each other, because they know the financial speak. Yes, you're obviously in the meeting but your accountant or whoever represents your interests and their accountant represents their interests, and they need to fight it out basically around, because they know the business speak and the financial speak, and you just are there to express what your needs are, and they have to represent that. I would say probably that sounds like what you were able to do, because a lot of practice owners who ask about this buying and selling, it surprises me when they haven't had the practice evaluated themselves. And that's always one of the first pieces of advice I give. I say, yes, it's going to cost you money to do a valuation, but it will cost you even more money if you decide to buy it and it's not what, do you know what I mean? Rather take it as the lesser of the risk, that you spend the money and you end up not buying the practice, and that money is now but, or you end up buying the practice and now you know and you are confident that what you are buying is, legitimately feasible from a financial point of view.
I think it's a big commitment, and speaking is, and it comes back to what I spoke about earlier of having someone with you in the transition period. I think it's also important to realize that somehow we get this idea that we must open our own practices. And the reality is also not everyone necessarily wants to be their own boss or be the boss of other people, navigate all these things. You might be a clinical clinician. So also I think knowing what you're getting yourself into, because I think I'm always that person who thinks, I'm aware I'll have to make sacrifices, but you don't really know what those sacrifices are until you've got some exposure to the day-to-day. So my thought would also be really explore and investigate if you're not familiar with a practice. Try and find out if you can come and shadow, if you can observe, if you can go through day-to-day, like what is contact with the billing companies or with the hospital man. What would all these things look like, so that you really understand what you're signing up for? Because I think, for me, I don't have a full clinical load because there's so much other things that needs to be managed, that at the end of the day, if I wanted to be a solely clinical therapist, I wouldn't get that joy from the job that I have today. My role is completely shifted.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things I always say. You need to first ask yourself, why do you want to own a practice, first of all? And then secondly, do you have the business mindset to do that? And that is definitely one of the questions that I listed in there, is to say, like, you okay with giving up some of the clinical responsibilities?
Can you hear me, Tasneem?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. We lost each other there a little bit. Okay. So what I just wanted to then touch on is the whole aspect of employment. So your practice is one of the few practices that I'm aware of that actually pays people like employees. So you pay a salary, you have benefits. So when they come and work for you, it's like going to work for a normal job at a company, right? Which is quite unique for health practices. And unfortunately, it is a bit of a bugbear of mine that there is a lot of exploitation that is happening in our industry. And so what would you say would be, obviously the reason why is because of maybe not being able to generate enough of a regular revenue to be able to feel confident that you can meet those commitments. So what would you say would be some of the key things that you take into consideration or implement to be able to give that job security to your employees?
I think, so when I bought over the practice, that was the payment model. I think any payment model has its pros and cons. But I think for me, what's been the decision, and this has been something that's come up a lot of times for me that I've reflected on, I've asked around about. But I think for me, when you have a team and there is ability to work harder to earn more income, what I find is conflict arises because who's going to take the work, who's not going to take the work. We also have this situation, and I've actually picked it up with our team in previous years, where if there's an extra weekend available for extra money, certain people will burn themselves out as well because they're chasing the income, but they're not actually taking time to, relax and have downtime. One of my thoughts as well is, as an in-hospital practice, we see fluctuations in how busy we are. December, January, like mid-December to mid-January, dead quiet. But then there's other times when it's really busy. And we've tried to sort of, I think one of my greatest lessons was looking at my practice's cash flow over a year. I don't look at it from month to month, but it's also the luxury when you've been in practice for some time. As a side note, in the early years of the practice, I diligently put money away. Like, I was very, frugal is not the right word, but very conscientious of what was necessary and what wasn't necessary, in building up what I like to call a nest egg, which one of the good things about that was that we were able to keep paying salaries when COVID hit, even though we didn't have nearly enough work for everyone. But my thoughts are that when we work for a salary, then I can easily delegate, and it becomes what is clinical need and not what is personal preference. We can easily keep people accountable to say, but we're all earning a market-related, equalized salary, so we all have to contribute equally. But that also speaks to having protocols and processes in place which communicate clearly what are the expectations of the team, when it's busy, when it's less busy. And I think what I find with having a salaried income is you don't have people going out and seeking all these additional jobs to fill in low months, which often comes at the expense of the main job, when they're doing locum work at all these other practices to try and up their income. There have been some questions about, can we go over into this? And I said, okay, cool, we can consider it, but we need to be aware that that's not everyone's desire, because I think, especially as a junior therapist, a lot of the therapists value the fact that they know each month this is what they're taking home. They can make decisions. So if we move to a place where certain therapists are on depending how many patients you see income versus others on our salary, then obviously in low months, those who are on a salary would get patient preference first, which I think makes it hard to manage the workload. But I think at the end of the day, you have to diligently plan cash flow to make sure in the slow months that you've prepared in the busy months to have that cash flow available to pay salaries.
I think it's excellent advice, because it's funny that is exactly what the topic was at our event, where Growth Accounting Services spoke about managing cash flow as the key thing you need to actually do, and looking at, and he did say you need to have at least 3 to 6 months of, operating expenses covered in case something happens that you can't that you can still pay salaries, for example. So I wanted to end off, we're just hitting the tail end of the discussion now, and I just wanted to then come full circle in terms of the support discussion. You are obviously also part of INSTOPP. So tell us a little bit about what your decision to become part of INSTOPP, and what kind of, because obviously INSTOPP provides a lot of that kind of support because it's specifically for the private practice OTs. So what was your decision to become part of INSTOPP, and what is it what kind of support can private OTs actually get through INSTOPP? Because I feel like a lot of people don't really know what they can get. So if you could just share some light on that.
So maybe just as a starting point, I have always been one of those people who, I belong to everything. I want to make sure that when stuff happens, that I've got connections with the right people. And myself, I don't really see myself as a good networker, but I made the decision to join when I was nominated. Firstly, because I think it's so important for us as experienced practitioners and practice owners to actually share our wisdom. I think one of the hardest things for me is sometimes how, and I think it's from what I hear, a quite general thing in healthcare, that people hold their information quite close to their chest. And for me, I don't want younger therapists or other practice owners to suffer when I've gone through something and I've learned some lessons the hard way, and I can share and I can hopefully make your journey a little bit easier. It's quite important for me that we create a space where the OTs of the future are going to love the profession and are going to be passionate. And that's also part of my decision to have fourth year UP students come in for their clinical blocks at the practice. So I think that's sort of the background to how I think about these organizations and the different platforms. So I really wanted to make sure that I'm contributing. And I think my practice has also gotten to a point where it's stable. I've figured a lot of the stuff out. There's always new stuff to figure out, but I've figured stuff out. I've got a great team that is really supportive, that are incredibly competent. So I've actually been able, through all the years of putting protocols and procedures and figuring problems out, been able to free up some of my time. So I must see it as my practice's ability to give back to the OT community, because being on the board is a voluntary service. And then in terms of what INSTOPP offers, I think first and foremost this year we have the association with Healthman, and Healthman is a legal entity that helps with audits, that provides advice about clinical contracts, about business contracts. I mean, they can help you with business registration. So pretty much anything from a legal point of view, and they are specialized in healthcare. So they also represent, I think is it SASOP or PsychMG, but quite a few of the healthcare professions, like their bodies or their, do you call it, like almost organizations, they represent them and they help them with legal matters. So they draft documents for NHI, etc. So they really do in terms of free counseling sessions or consults with the Healthman team, and they have lawyers and accountants and everything you need to know on that side. There are free mentorship sessions that are offered throughout the year. INSTOPP, what I really appreciate as well is putting therapists in contact with mentors. So part of our priority is to make sure that if there's a therapist going through something, we can link them up with a network of peers that have been proven to be ethical and to drive good businesses and drive good practice. So you can be linked up with them. Obviously, there's a whole lot of workshops. And as an organization, we work quite a lot on drafting documents and SOPs, etc., for NHI, for Council of Medical Schemes. So making sure we try and stay on top of the matters that are important to sustain OT private practices. So that's really the prerogative. Yeah, and I think the more hands, as I said earlier, that are willing to offer a little bit of time, the greater things we can do as an organization, whether it is any of the OT organizations that you decide to end up joining.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a real testament to see how organized and how much you guys get done, knowing that all of you are also full-time working in your own practices, that obviously you have, it kind of, you modeling, what good practice is through how it's evident in the way that you guys run INSTOPP, that you are actually like, good managers of organizations. Do you know what I mean? Like if INSTOPP was run like shabbily and disorganized, then, well, how can we trust your advice on managing a practice? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I really want to give kudos to the INSTOPP team. You guys are really doing amazing work. And, people always ask me, I'm a real advocate for collaboration over competition. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between what Private Practice Growth Club does and INSTOPP and Business Side of Medicine, and there's a few other people out there. But for me, it's like we can't all serve everybody. And so we find our little niche in that space of what we can do. And for me, if I promote private OTs joining INSTOPP and they can get value out of it, that is the whole mission and purpose of Private Practice Growth Club in the first place. So if that's where they need to go to get what they need, then by all means, I'm not going to not talk about INSTOPP because they like competition. Doesn't make sense. So yeah, just kudos to the INSTOPP team. I think you guys are really doing fantastic work, and also just the innovation in what you are introducing every year on year. That's really fantastic. But thank you so much, Chantelle. I think we didn't even get into the questions around systems and processes. I think that is probably a whole conversation for another day. But I think all the other things you spoke about were probably more important, especially for those people who are just entering into the private practice space or considering buying a practice or selling a practice. So thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tasneem, and it's always lovely collaborating with you. Thank you for the wonderful opportunity to join you on your channel today. It's been lovely having a chat with you.
And of course, I will put all of the links to INSTOPP and to your practice and all of that in the description box below the video. So if anybody wants to get in touch with INSTOPP looking for mentorship, I'm assuming that's where the best way would be to reach out. And thank you so much.